Why read Calvin's Institutes? What version should you get? And tips for finishing. We're going to cover all of that and more in this video. Let's get started. Hey guys, Joe here, back to the Word. Today with a cool video that's been in the works for a while. Why read Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion? What version should you get in English? What translations are out there? What are the tips for finishing this over 1,000 or so page read, depending on what version you get? I've put this in a longer video format. I easily could have made 4 or 5 videos with the content you're going to have in this one video, but what I have done is timestamped all of that information. So you can see in the description for this video, or just by dragging the cursor along the bottom if you're watching on your phone or another device, to see the different topics and hop to the one that answers the question you're most interested in. Obviously, you can watch the whole thing from front to beginning to get the whole video as well. This has been an exciting topic to dig into. The sections and the contents of this video, we're going to cover why read John Calvin, short little history about him, why read the Institutes of the Christian Religion, history of the Institutes / the editions, what English translations exist, which versions to get and read of the English translations. I'm going to cover the major 3 and also a 4th that I'm excited about that's supposed to be published in the next couple of years. Where to start as you're getting into the Institutes, tips for finishing Calvin's Institutes, and then sources of research I used for making this video. I want to share that with all of you. First up, channel plug here. This is Back to the Word. This channel exists to encourage you and equip you to read the Bible, good books, and have conversations that truly matter. This totally fits in the good book category. This book comes highly recommended by many people in the Christian religion, theologians, not just by those who are in the Reformed faith traditions or denominations. I also want to say this, why did I do this video? As I was going through seminary, I just had multiple people say you should read John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. I didn't know too much about it. I was encouraged to get some different versions to read through it, but it's over 900 pages regardless kind of what translation you get. And so now that I'm done with my MDiv and I have some time to read and spend time on different matters and do deep studies, I wanted to get into the Institutes. And so I've been slowly making my way through this edition, which I'll talk about a little later in the video. I'm not fully through yet, but I'm enjoying it. And I wanted to share it with all of you. And as I've shared some of my reflections on it online, people have been asking questions. And so I wanted to deep dive those questions and put together this video for all of you. So with that, you're going to see my notes scrolling on to the left of your screen. I'm going to pop up images of different versions and editions that I'm talking about and books. And we're going to make our way through this video. At any point, you can just hop to the question or the section that's best for you or answers your question that you have, because the timestamp is there. If you have questions, I would love to learn with you guys. So ask me questions. I'd love to go study. I'd also love to if you have insights or favorite translation or something I missed, I would love to hear from all of you as well. And like always, like, subscribe. If you like this video, more people see it. If you subscribe, you get more of this content. And I'd love to share with you guys and see more people get great gospel content that's directing them to the Bible, good books, and great conversations around theology. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So first up, why read John Calvin? A short history. You can see my notes on the side. Pause if you want to read them more in depth. I'm going to give you the general overview as we walk through these points on who Calvin was. So John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, was born John Calvin. So he was born in France, and his last name was later Latinized by his dad into Calvinus or Calvin. So he was a French theologian, pastor, and reformer. Most notably spent most of his time in Geneva, Switzerland during the Protestant Reformation. So he was educated in humanism and piety. So that's kind of where he learned to write well. He went to college. His dad had a relationship with the church, and so that's where you got money. So his Calvin was preparing to be a priest, and then his dad fell out of favor, most likely with the church, and so his son switched to a degree in law, which is probably where he learned to orate and speak well, or at least one of the sources of Calvin learning to speak well. He got saved and then became a Protestant and eventually had to flee France because of the persecution of Protestants by the Roman Catholic Church in France and by the French king. So after publishing a first version of his Institutes, which is what this video is primarily carrying, he was fleeing France. He ended up staying in Basel, Switzerland, where he wrote on a first version of his Institute. So it was a short visit, and after writing that, he came back to Italy and France for a short visit. And Calvin took a detour through Geneva on his way to Strasbourg, where he planned to continue his scholarly pursuit. So he wanted to continue to write for the Protestant cause, for the Christian faith. And on his way there, he passed through Geneva. And so William Farel, you see him right there, who had swayed most of French-speaking Switzerland towards Protestantism, heard that Calvin was in town. We'll get soon in this video to what Calvin's first edition of the Institutes included, but it was well known, well received by people as a way to teach about the Christian faith. It was more to catechize people into what the Christian faith was and what they Protestants believed, and so it was well known. So he heard Calvin was in town and famously convinced him to stay in Geneva and to lead them to pastor the city, and to pastor the city which had declared itself as a Protestant city. So in April 1538, Farel and Calvin were both banished from Geneva. The political climate changed and there was growing opposition. And so then Calvin moved to Strasbourg and used this time to revise and expand his Institutes, which we'll cover later in the editions and sections of the Institutes. During this time, he also got married to Idelette. She was a widow of an Anabaptist leader who had 2 children. Calvin and Idelette had no children survive infancy that they had together, and then she eventually passed away, and he never remarried. In 1541, the political climate in Geneva changed, and Calvin's supporters begged him to return to Geneva. So in September of 1541, Calvin moved back to Geneva, and with the goal of making it into a model community based on biblical teaching. He set up a 4-fold leadership structure, which he had based on the New Testament. And then he withstood many theological challenges during his time in that city, also expanded the Institutes, and started the Geneva Academy, which is probably one of his most substantial contributions, in that allowed him to train up men for the pastorate and then send them out to teach and create Reformed or Protestant churches. John Knox stated that Calvin's Geneva was the most perfect school of Christ that ever was since the days of the apostles. And so I have no time in this video to get into how he structured Geneva and some of the things there, but this is one of the reasons Calvinists were studying in the way that he structured society, the church, the importance of Christianity for this city. Calvin experienced a lot of pain and sickness. The last 5 years of his life, he dealt with a lot of health problems, sometimes even lecturing in his bedroom for the students that he had and the church, but refused to slow down. He really refused to stop working and died in 1564 at the age of 54. So Calvin is most known for his commentaries. He wrote one on every book of the Bible except Song of Solomon and Revelation. Those are the only 2 he did not write commentaries on. And the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is what this video is about. And so I pulled most of this history from the Hendrickson copy that I've been reading through right here, and then have used some other supplemental resources to fill in gaps on Calvin's history. He's worth reading because he's one of these polarizing features in the Reformation. These people, he was aware of Zwingli, he was aware of Luther and the Lutherans and these conversations they were having, and he really condenses a lot, and he writes a lot on what the Reformed Protestant faith believed. And so his Institutes is worth reading for many reasons, which we're going to get into next. So, second, why read the Institutes of the Christian Religion? So I have here some reasons from me and also some from some other authors and some online articles as well. So first, it's comprehensive subject and intended use. So what's the content of the Institutes of the Christian Religion? So Calvin uses the outline of the Apostles' Creed And his subject in the Institutes is the knowledge of God, and that which leads us to blessed immortality, and also the knowledge of ourselves as sinful human beings. And so that's the two kind of fold focus for his Institutes. His original intended use for the Institutes was to be used as a manual for assisting every Christian with their beliefs and how to live according to those beliefs. So something very helpful to help them catechize or to understand the Christian religion. It was then expanded later to really be both serve that purpose and as a handbook to train up pastors in theology. And so as he got into later, more expanded editions. First, I also want to cover the word institute. The word institute does not mean the same. We're not supposed to think about institution like a church. It's not the institution of the Christian religion, meaning on the church, but it's more or less dealing with the instruction is in view when he used this word. So it's the instruction of the Christian religion. What are the teachings? What's the doctrine of the Christian religion? What does it believe? What do we believe as Christians is kind of the force of the Institutes. Second, Calvin's focus on Christian doctrine, but also Christian godliness and piety. Calvin is not just about people knowing right, but living right. And that's a focus throughout his Institutes at all levels of the editions that he wrote. The Institutes, number 3, may be easier to read than you think. This point comes from Justin Taylor of Crossway, who did a good article on why you should read the Institutes. So he talks about it might be easier to read than you think. J.I. Packer wrote the readability of the Instituo, so he's referring to the Institutes, considering its size, is remarkable. I have there a note from C.S. Lewis's introduction to Athanasius on the Incarnation. If you've never read the introduction to this little work from the popular patristic series, this is the probably most famous introduction ever written to any theological book by C.S. Lewis. He talks in there about the importance of actually reading people's actual works. So we have this idea in theology. It's like, well, I'm going to read the summary of this person's work. They've written so much. How can I read their actual works? They feel so distant. I'm going to read a summary of what they wrote. And he says, if we actually go and encounter the man we're reading about and read his actual works, we may find that he's easier to read. And that's so true when it comes to reading John Calvin. You're going to find that he's easier to read and easier to approach and understand than you originally think is possible. Number 4, why read the Institutes? The Institutes is one of the wonders of the world. This is pointed out by Justin Taylor. He quotes J.I. Packer wrote, Calvin Institutes is one of the wonders of the literary world, of the spiritual world, and the theological world. You can go check out the actual article that Justin wrote. I left the link in the video description, and also it's in the works cited at the end of this video to go read what Packer says in those different categories makes the Institutes stand out. Karl Barth also wrote, I could gladly and profitably set myself down and spend all the rest of my life with just Calvin. So, what good recommendations right there. Number 5, the Institutes has relevance for your life and ministry. This comes from Justin Taylor. It talks about it can be read as simply an exercise in historical theology, but it should also be read to further your understanding of God's word, God's work, and God's ways. So very good reasons to read the Institutes right there. So you're thinking about getting into reading the Institutes. What are the history and editions that Calvin did? So I'm going to cover the main 4 that we see crop up in the history of Calvin and his Institutes. In the Banner of Truth edition, it talks about that all in total, Calvin did 6 editions in Latin and 3 in French. And so these are the major 4 that I'm going to talk about here, where we saw massive changes and additions. And I'm going to talk about what those additions were. All right, so the history of the Institutes / editions. So his first edition was published in 1536. It was done in Latin, and this truly was a first draft. I've already talked a little bit about it. It was published during his time in Basel, Switzerland, as he was writing there and had fled from France because of persecution against the Protestants. This edition contained 6 chapters. It had a preface addressed to King Francis I. And so Calvin submits these beliefs of the Christian religion, sends them is writing in Latin, which was the language used by the priesthood of the day. That was what all spiritual religious writings were in at the time, not in the vulgar common language of the people, but in Latin, which was the priesthood's language, the church document language. And so he writes it in that language. He sends this note, a preface to King Francis I about how the Protestants are not trying to divide the church, but they're actually trying to bring and recover what the original apostolic church was and trying to retrieve that and bring it into the Roman Catholic Church. And so he writes that. And so it is included in this first edition. It's called pocket-sized, but it was 520 pages in total. Doesn't sound totally pocket-sized to me. And its writing format, it was a question and answer format, served as a teaching tool for Christians in the church. It was a way for them to recite and know what the Christian religion was all about and what Protestant Christians believed. So he does that edition. Then after some time in Geneva, he gets to Strasbourg. And in 1539, he releases an expanded edition of his Institutes. So 1539 in Latin. And then he does a translation into French in 1541. And so this edition, over the 6 of the first edition, has 17 chapters. He reorganizes the content. It's still in question and answer format. He addressed the knowledge of God before the knowledge of ourselves in relation to God. So we see kind of that organization takes place in his writing. It's still for Christians in the church, but he also has this idea of it being an introductory manual for pastors being trained in theology to pastor churches. Major additions to this edition of the Institutes by Calvin is he adds a basic introduction into the knowledge of God. He adds some topics like divine election and free will and some other pastoral topics he adds. He adds an extensive section on baptism and what is now called a covenant theology as he defends infant baptism against the Anabaptists that would have been in Strasbourg that were pushing against infant baptism and advocating for believers' baptism. So they were against, that's what the Anabaptists, against the baptism of infants. They only felt baptism was for believers, those who were truly regenerate and born again. And so he defends infant baptism against them. And so I quote there from the Barrett book, 684 through 685. I'll cover that at the end of this and the sources mentioned, but for those who are at this point in the video, I'm talking here about the Reformation as its renewal. This was a great book. It's a textbook on the Reformation. Matthew Barrett has done a great job in this book, and so this was very helpful in putting together this video. And so that's the claim and kind of where Barrett tells us about these editions, and that's where I got this info from. Now, moving on to the third kind of well-known edition of Calvin's Institutes. He moves back to Geneva. He's leading the town, fourfold structure, biblical town. He's trying to do a bunch with it there. And he works on an edition of his Institutes and releases another edition in 1543 in Latin and then 1545 in French. And so this has over 17 chapters. This one has now 21 chapters worth of content. Then we skip ahead about 14 or so years. Some think that Calvin might have actually thought that he was going to die, and so he published this massive final version of his Institutes, this revised edition. So you have the 1559 edition in Latin, and then it was translated 1560 into French and published from Geneva, Switzerland. It has 80 chapters in 4 books. So this is the final edition that he published during his lifetime. It's the final massive revised edition. The major addition to this edition is that he went through everything he had talked before. He added to it. He refined it. He added multiple things to it. But the big one is that he went through and he incorporated over the course of his career the conflicts he had been in. And so he's writing throughout and commenting on those conflicts and refining his theology and what he was saying the Christians believed. And so what is the layout of this edition? So he has corresponding to sections of the Apostles' Creed. So it still has in the background the layout of the Apostles' Creed, but then also that knowledge of God, teaching about who God is, and then knowledge of ourselves. So both of those are there. And so we see that the layout, the books 1, 2, 3, and 4 follow the layout of the Apostles' Creed. So book 1, God the Creator, has 18 chapters. So think about, I believe in the God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. That's kind of the content of book 1. You have book 2, God the Redeemer, 17 chapters. Move to Apostles' Creed, I believe in Jesus Christ. That's a section on Christology and other things primarily. Book 3, God the Holy Spirit and his work of grace, that of saving us. 25 chapters. He says, and think about in the Apostles' Creed, I believe in the Holy Spirit. And then book 4, the Church or Society of Christ, is 20 chapters. And you think about the Holy Catholic Church, meaning the universal church of Jesus Christ, kind of covered in that book and section. So that's the layout of those things. Now, what translations in English exist? So we've just read and seen that there's Latin, like he originally wrote in Latin, then he would translate it into his native language in French. He's living in Geneva, French-speaking Switzerland. He's translating into the language of the people. What translation exists for us in English? So here's some of the major English translations. I'm going to go through the major 4, and then I'm going to talk about a 5th one that's supposed to come out real soon that I think is worth paying attention to. The first edition was done by Thomas Norton. So it was translated not long after the publication of Calvin's last final massive revised edition of the Institutes. One note here is as you look up and potentially try to get this edition that came out, that's from 1561-ish, you may also see the print date 1581 because that's where there was kind of a reprint of his translation work by Norton. So that's one you may run across. Second one was done in 1813 by John Allen. So he translated the Institutes. In his own words, he said Norton's Institutes needed to be updated and a new translation was needed because it had long been too antiquated, uncouth, and obscure to convey any just idea of the original work, and abounds with passages which to the modern English reader cannot but altogether be unintelligible. So there's his reasons for translating this work again. So both of those, Norton and Allen's, exist for a while. And then in 1845, you will have William Henry Beveridge, a member of the Calvin Translation Society, who translates the Institutes. He references Norton's work heavily, and then references also primarily some of Calvin's own 1560 French translation of his final edition. So he does this translation from the Latin final edition, but he also relies heavily on Norton and then also Calvin's translation into French from 1560. That exists for a while, and then you have the 1960 translation by Ford Lewis Battles, and J.T. McMill did the translation as a part of the Library of Christian Classics series that has since served as the standard for students of Calvin worldwide. So that's the version I'll get into in a moment. That's kind of the gold standard that a lot of academics still use today, as we'll talk about the Battles translation. So most people talk about the Beveridge translation or the Norton translation or the Beveridge translation. Also upcoming, worth talking about here, due out potentially in 2025, as I'm filming this in 2023, is that Anthony N.S. Lane is serving as the general editor, and Raymond Blackadder is serving as the primary translator for a new translation of Calvin's Institutes, and they are publishing that with Crossway, and so it's potentially due out in 2025. Their goal with this new edition is to produce a fresh, contemporary, and accurate translation from the Latin text, which references Calvin's French edition when significant. It also desires to make the Institutes readable and accessible to a wide audience, clearly indicate which biblical passages and Christians Calvin himself cites. So they talk about that some of these previous English translations, because Calvin didn't put quote marks around things, and sometimes he just quoted a Bible verse in a line and didn't really cite it, it's hard to know whether he did that or not. And so they say some of these other English translations put verses in where Calvin did not. And so they're working on this new translation to try to clear some of those things up, to clear which Christians Calvin was actually citing and which ones he was not. They also want to provide an apparatus that does not impose modern categories on the text, so things various section headings that make theological conclusions that would not belong to Calvin himself. They also want to do this new edition to offer explanatory notes where necessary that are clearly distinguished from Calvin's own citations. If you have the Battles edition and the McNeill as the general editor, they have footnotes. But they do not delineate, as I've studied it, between the footnotes Calvin made in his Institutes and the footnotes they have added. You don't know which one is which. And so there's a need for a new translation that delineates which footnotes Calvin made and which footnotes the translators and the editors have made. And then it's also supposed to be published with high production values. I'm really hoping we get something similar to what Crossway has done with Stephen Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God. I don't know how many volumes Crossway is going to do, but I'm really hoping we get something like that. I would be so glad to have it in my library. So now we're at to the part. This is the part a lot of you probably clicked on this video for. Which version in English should I get and read of Calvin's Institutes? I'm going to cover the major three, and then I'm going to add a fourth one that's due out soon, as I've already mentioned in this video, that would be worth thinking about getting. So first, Battles and McNeill. This is the gold standard for academics Calvin scholarship today, as I'm filming this video, 2023. So you have the Battles and McNeill edition, published by Westminster John Knox Press. You see the details there. It's 2 volumes, just over 1,800 pages. It was published in hardcover and multiple, there's 2 different images on the front. One is gray and green. One is gold and kind of white. And then there's a paperback edition as well. Retails up from $75 and up if you get the print edition. It's the current gold standard, but it has had, at least I know of, a printing issue run with the paperback edition, where some people were getting the cover that said Volume 1 or the first, Volume 1, and they had a cover of Volume 2, but the insides, the book block of the Volume 1. So they had a cover that said Volume 1 and inside was Volume 1. And then they had a cover that said Volume 2 and the inside was the book block from Volume 1. Or a variation of that. And so that was a known issue that's out there. So I'm just saying, if you're going to go get that edition in print, just be very careful and just make sure when it arrives that you check it. If it's wrong, send it back and make sure you get an edition that is correct so that you get the insides of both Volume 1 and Volume 2. The second English edition that's out there massively, you can get other English editions. There are some out there, but these are the ones that are most readily available, that people talk about, that are easier to get, and so I want to share those, is the Beveridge published by Hendrickson in 1 volume. So that is the version I have right here. I have the Battles one on Logos digitally, and then I have the print version. This is the one I'm currently reading through, is the Beveridge Hendrickson edition in 1 volume. I believe Hendrickson at some point published this edition over a couple volumes, 2 volumes or so, but this is one from 2007 where they put it all in 1 cover, hardback, pretty nicely done. It's well printed. It's the translation of Calvin's final edition of the Institutes, which Battles is as well. And then it's generally the cheapest option. You can pick this up for somewhere, it retails for $30, but you can pick this up for somewhere around $20, depending on what sale people are doing and where you get this book from. Third edition that a lot of you will know is out there that people talk about, it's pretty available to get, is the Banner of Truth translation, or the Banner of Truth edition from the French edition of 1541. So Battles and Beveridge are from the final edition, so the most expanded, largest edition of Calvin's Institutes. The Banner of Truth one is from the French 1541 edition. So it's 1 volume, 920 pages. It's cloth bound. It was published in 2014. Retails from 40-ish or so up. Translation done by Robert White. And then they share from the publisher, it's there on your screen in my notes, why they published the 1541 edition. It gets down to the fact that this is not so expansive. It keeps things very clean, and Calvin was translating it for his people in his common language. And so they think that should be reserved. To say, avoiding the technical details and much of the polemics of the final work. So that's his conversation, him defending his theology against opponents of the final work. They said it's not in this edition. They say it keeps it cleaner. The Institutes of 1541 offers a clear and comprehensive account of the work of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit in creation, revelation, and redemption in the life of the individual Christian and in the worship and witness of the church. And so that's just something to know as you look at that edition. That's not the final edition of Calvin's Institutes, but it is 1541 French edition. And those are the benefits of having that edition. Finally, a fourth edition, not available yet. It's due out in 2025 or so by Crossway, is the Lane and Blackadder edition. Lane as the editor, Blackadder as the primary translator of this new edition. It's going to be published by Crossway. We don't know how many volumes it's going to be. We know it's going to have high production values. I've already shared in this video. I hope we get something very similar to Stephen Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God. But we just don't know yet. We don't know how many pages it's going to be. It might be cloth overboard. It might be true tone overboard. And we don't know what the price is going to be. It's worth looking at and thinking about. I'm reading through this one right now, but I am looking forward to this future edition. Crossway has a PDF that's online. I've linked to it in the video description and also for the sources cited at the end of this video, where you can go read about this translation and why they think it's worth doing and why they took on the project. And so you can go read more about their test translations, even 30 or so test pages about what this is going to look like. And I'm definitely looking forward to this edition. So if you're watching this today and the Crossway version's not out, I'm telling you here are the three that would be good to choose from. If you have a choice of the Crossway edition, that would be also something to look at as well. All right. Moving on, where to start. So I've covered editions to get, why read John Calvin. Now you have an edition, you've bought an English translation, either digitally or physically. I'm a physical book person. Where do you start? So first, you need to get a copy and start reading. So I already covered that briefly right there. So digitally or physically. Then I would say, don't skip the beginning things, the history things, the preface things, what's the features of the edition that you have. Those are all helpful tools. I don't know how many people spend time reading books and they go straight to chapter 1 and you read and you don't know the person's historical context. You don't know how they organize the work. You don't know all those details, and publishers today do a good job of telling you those things so that you get more out of your reading. Also, study the layout of the book. Spend time with the table of contents for the Institute so you see the way Calvin laid things out, and so you can navigate the work successfully. I have there a citation just to give you an idea that Calvin's work, even though this is one volume from Hendrickson, they still have this divided into the 4 books that Calvin published in the final edition. And so when you're finding a section in Calvin's Institutes, and I look at this citation, I know from the table of contents and my study of the layout that this person is quoting from the 3rd book, and it's the 6th section and the 1st paragraph, or the first kind of sectional paragraph. So I know exactly where this person is quoting from. So you can use that and need to know that as you navigate the book. Also, feel the freedom to skip around and read sections that most interest you. In a massive work like this, you're only going to get through this a few pages at a time, it's like eating an elephant, one bite at a time. Don't be afraid to skip to some of your favorite topics and sections and just read those. Enjoy reading Calvin on some of your favorite issues. But if you do plan to read cover to cover, here's ways to have a plan. So first, search online for a reading plan. There are some that exist. Chapel Library has reading a year plan. very helpful. Set a number of pages per day. That might be something helpful for you. I'm going to read 5 pages a day, 10 pages a day, 15 pages a day. It's called the drip reading method. That's one way to make it through a book like this, is to set a goal like that. Also, set a time. Maybe you're going to read 15 minutes a day. Maybe you're going to read 10 minutes a day. You'll be so impressed and so kind of just surprised how much of a book you can make it through when you set aside just 10 minutes a day to read dedicated in that book. Justin Taylor says in his article on why you should read Calvin's Institutes that if you just take 15 minutes a day and read the Institutes at a decent pace of reading, you should be able to read the Institutes from cover to cover twice in 1 year. And so that's quite encouraging. Also, some of you may think, well, this is a huge, massive book. I don't know where to start. Maybe you should start with a little book on the Christian life by Calvin first. So I have my edition that I read through right here, published by Ligonier, a little book on the Christian life. This work is an abridgment, so it's a smoothed over, condensed abridgment of Calvin Institute's chapters 6 through 10 in book 3. So it's really these it's 5 chapters of Calvin's Institutes. So I have them here in expanded form. And so they've made them into smaller chapters here over the same rich topics and content, and they've made it easier to digest. And so you might want to start there. And so that's going to help you learn what he says about holiness, about pursuing Christ as Christians, and that may whet your appetite for tackling a bigger reading assignment in the full volume that you have picked up to read. And then finally, keep going. That's just my tips for where to start, is that you must keep going. You have to keep going if you're going to finish, if you're going to endure. Which gets me to the next section of the video. Yes, I know this video is long, but this is an important section of the video. Tips for finishing Calvin's Institutes. So I haven't even finished this yet, and I'm sharing some tips with you for finishing. These come from Crossway and Derek Thomas. I've linked to his article in this video as well if you want to check these out, but I've kind of summarized his tips for finishing. I think these are good tips, and I wanted to share them with you in this video. Is don't get confused by its seeming disproportionality. He says, as you read through this work, you're going to notice that there's certain topics that Calvin treats in length. He just like trees are destroyed because he takes so much pen and ink to cover a topic. And it's because it was a topic that was highly contested in his day. And so Thomas shares in the article that he refined this book over 25 years. He was listening to these conflicts between Zwingli, between the Lutherans, between Protestants and Anabaptists and the Roman Catholic Church. And so there were sections of doctrine that he expanded, and he wanted to be very clear. But just because he speaks a lot about that topic and little about another topic does not mean that other topic he's inferring is not important. And so as you read the Institutes, just don't get confused by that point. Also, second, use a guide. A guide may be a very helpful resource as you read through the Institutes. That there are parts that are really difficult, either because of Calvin's logic, his context, the types of things he's talking about. And so Thomas there has given 3 guide recommendations that you can see there on the screen. You can pause and read on your own. There's one from Anthony S. Lane. There's one from Hall and Lilybacks, and from P&R, and then there's also one from Battles, Ford Lewis Battles from P&R as well. You can search for those online. So the Lane one is from Baker, and so I have the names right there. So just pause the video, look at the notes right there. Those are 3 good guides potentially, and I'm sure there's others that have been written and may be helpful for you, or you can probably try to find some PDFs or free ones online as well. Number 3, for tips for finishing, don't expect to grasp everything in one reading. Like any good book or true classic, there are going to be parts that stand out to you, and there are going to be parts that you just are lost on. Like maybe it's not important to you, maybe you don't understand his logic, maybe you just don't understand it, and you just keep moving and keep reading. So some of those may be from his oratorical skills, him getting into verbal boxing matches with opponents where he shares this is a person who believes this and this is why the Christians don't believe that. And so you might have to read different parts again and again. He does suggest something of a guide, like a good guide to Calvin's detractors will greatly help. So he recommends there from Gary Jenkins, Calvin's Tormentors, Understanding the Conflicts That Shaped the Reformer. That may help you as you're reading through like an area on the Trinity and go, who did Calvin do battle with over Trinitarian theology and in what way? That type of guide will help you out. So, number 4, mark Calvin's summaries at the conclusion of each section. So, Calvin provided short summaries of his arguments, either at the beginning, some publishers put them at the beginning, some of them put them at the end of each book or each section. So, locate those as you're reading through. They will greatly help you understand what Calvin is trying to most essentially say through his Institutes. Number 5, understand the reason why Calvin initially wrote the Institutes. We've discussed this already in this video, but if you skip reading the preface, you will miss so much. You'll miss like why there's an address to the King of France. You'll miss what his purpose was for the initial edition of the Institutes. You'll miss why knowing about God and knowing about ourselves and those themes and laying it out according to the Apostles' Creed. And those are just important things. I have there on the notes, you can pause to read more. You'll miss that Calvin wrote them to show primarily Francis I, the King of France, that Protestants were not being schismatic. They were not just trying to divide the church over anything. They were trying to have the church return to the apostolic faith, the one holy Catholic Church apostolic faith from the times of the New Testament. And so they wanted to retrieve those things and have the church go back to them. They were indeed loyal and French citizens and defenders of the Holy Catholic Church. History shows the king did not believe Calvin on this point, but this shows why Calvin takes so much time. As you're reading through the Institutes and you go, why is he spending so much time showing why the Protestant reformers are in continuity with the patristics and believe the same things as the church in the past and the Church of the Apostles? And why is he agreeing with Augustine in different ways, even though Calvin would disagree with him in other ways? And you see that because he's trying to show that continuity, that they are not something new. They're not just trying to divide the church. They're actually trying to retrieve something that is old, which if you want more on that, this book right here, The Reformation as Renewal, is really good because Barrett talks about how the reformers, not just Calvin, were trying to do that and how they went about doing it. So book recommend right there. Number 6, tips for finishing. As you understand those things and you're going through, understand Calvin's aim is to promote piety. When you hear piety, it's not just knowing the way of Jesus, is the way I remember it, but living the way of Jesus. He wanted people to have right thinking and belief, but also that to translate into right living. So Calvin defined piety as the union of reverence and love for God, which the knowledge of his benefit inspires. So that's from 1:1. So try asking yourself at the end of every section that Calvin writes in the Institutes, how should I respond to this truth? How can it inform the way that I live? And what graces should I manifest by the Holy Spirit's aid as I read this? So, final section of this video, sources of research used for the making of this video. I'm going to leave those in the notes section. Just pause and you can look through those. I've also included links to most of these resources in the video description for this video, so you can just expand that. I will take this time as you look at those resources and read through them to just thank you for watching this video. I am super excited to continue reading through John Calvin's The Institutes of the Christian Religion. I'll probably do a video once I finish, just on some of my reflections. And I'm super excited for Crossway's edition and translation to come out 2025. Sparing the Lord doesn't return sooner, to dive into more of these topics with you. Let me know if you have any questions, if there's any observations that I may have missed. I would love to learn with all of you guys and answer any questions that you may have. So with that, I want to encourage you to like, subscribe, leave a comment, and until next time, continue to read, treasure, follow the word. God bless, and I'll see you guys soon.